This is the Thrive Podcast with Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. And now, Pastor Fred Jeff Smith.
Hello, and welcome to the 15th edition of the Thrive Podcast with the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. I'm Fred Jeff Smith, pastor of Shiloh, and I'm very happy that you've taken the time to either view or listen to the podcast today. We appreciate all those who have tuned in or listened in to the podcast, and we pray that the conversations you have found to be interesting and informative and helpful to you. I am honored and privileged today to have as my guest Pastor Tommy N. Gibson Jr., pastor of the Donaldson Chapel Baptist Church of Baton Rouge. Pastor Gibson, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us in the Thrive Podcast.
You're very much welcome.
Talk to us about Tommy Gibson, because Tommy Gibson has a very rich background. For those who do not know, Pastor Gibson at one time in his life was a police officer with the Baton Rouge Police Department, and we're going to talk about police reform hopefully before this podcast is over. Pastor Gibson is a practicing attorney here in Baton Rouge, as well as pastor of the Donaldson Chapel Baptist Church, where he has served now for almost 21 years, and he does an outstanding job there. Tell us about Pastor Tommy Gibson.
Jack of all trades, the master of none. But a diversified background, I find more commonality in them than most people. That it's all of it involves serving the public and serving people and serving God's people, and it has been a blessing to have those type of experiences, and God has been allowed me to use them to hopefully maximize the potential of others more than myself.
Well, start with police department. You served how many years in the Baton Rouge Police Department?
10 years.
10 years. Talk about your experience with the police department.
Well, I started with the Baton Rouge City Police Department in 1974 as a cadet. I worked in the office for 1 year. I spent a very short time in uniform patrol, and in fact, my training officer was Warren Broussard, the officer who was murdered some years ago. And then I spent the remainder of my time in the criminal division, and the unit I was in, it started out as a burglary unit and evolved to a street crime unit, and we dealt with felony crimes, primarily burglaries, but we were plainclothes investigators, and so it was a unique experience.
Well, in that you have the experience of actually being a police officer, the rest of us are kind of like spectators at a football game. You know, if you've never played and if you've never coached, all you have is a wild opinion about how the game ought to go. For those of us who have never served in the police department, and yet we look at what's going on with regard to Baton Rouge Police Department today, not simply Alton Sterling, but all of these efforts to engage in police reform that are ongoing within our community, have been going on for several years now. As someone who served in the police department, you can provide a unique perspective on that. What are your thoughts regarding that?
Well, I think the movement, a police reform movement, is a national movement, and Baton Rouge is not exempt from the issues that confront police reform and general criminal justice reform altogether. I think culturally, we have a mythical understanding of what police work is with the media and how police work evolved over the last half century and before, police officers nationwide, particularly here, in most cases, are vastly underpaid, and they were viewed not much better than a lowly laborer. So, and Baton Rouge is not exempt to that. Proportionally, the police officers make today the same thing I made 30 years ago. Right. They have not been given a raise sufficiently to the type of work they perform. For what Baton Rouge pay for police officers, Baton Rouge have an excellent police department for what they pay. Now, with that said, because many of the officers who come to the department come to the department out of a passionate desire to serve. However, culturally, the police department, particularly in the South, has been used to promote the values of a Southern culture, and which exasperates the reform efforts here. The issue with the police department is not about individual officers; it's about the culture, the understanding the culture of the police department. And so reform is necessary. The things that are going on now are not new. For many decades, Baton Rouge did not have African-American police officers, did not have women, and only recently have you been getting, the last 15, 20 years, a number of officers. So the racial problems within the culture is highlighted within a police department. And I think that reform is necessary in a true understanding of community policing. So often, particularly in Baton Rouge, the police policies and procedures have been set for a top-down situation where the police department say, this is how we're going to police, and we're going to tell y'all how we're going to police, and the community doesn't have anything to do with it. That is from the deployment of human resources and so forth. I see where the new chief, Murphy Paul, was making some changes in the paper today about how accident calls were handled. And in my years of police work, I wonder why the traffic didn't write more traffic accidents, you know. I always wondered about that. Yes. So the foundation and the anchor of a police department is your uniform patrol division. With our vast geographical area that we must cover, you must have enough officers out there to patrol and not occupy, to interact with the community and so forth. So, and understanding that the police department cannot solve all of the social problems within a community. So.
Well, let's focus in a little bit more on the idea of reform and community policing. When the Sterling situation arose almost 2 years ago, you were one of the first people that I spoke with regard to police procedure and how that was carried out in the Sterling case, and that led to prolonged conversations, protracted conversations about police reform and what it should look like and what community policing should look like. Really and truly, you educated me on things that I really had no knowledge about. And one of the things that you pointed out is that the public's perception of community policing is vastly different from what community policing is supposed to or is intended to be. Can you expand on that?
Well, in regards to community policing, it involves your resources and how you utilize your resources and what input the community has in it. Community policing is not having a 4 or 5 person division that go out and play basketball with folks and speak at civic association. That's public relations. That's public relations. But having every division within your department involved in the community, solving problems in neighborhoods. We don't live by zip codes. We live by right where we are having this podcast. This is a neighborhood.
Yes.
This is a neighborhood. It should be some officers that know this neighborhood on an intimate basis, and that includes your criminal division. You engage one of the most controversial decisions are principles in community policing is what involvement the community should have in officer discipline, and that is a part. On the news last night, they had a situation where an officer had been fired. Civil Service brought him back. Now he's on the Civil Service board. That's an integrity problem.
Yeah,
that's an integrity problem, and it's no mechanism to deal with that within the setup of the structure of civil service and so forth. So
then, how is something like that dealt with? Is that a state legislature situation, or what would you think would be the way to respond to that?
The short answer, I don't know. I suspect it would be a legislative issue and a city council issue. But if it's civil service, fire, and municipal police, civil service, I suspect that it would be through the legislature. And there are the community, until recently with criminal justice reform, the community had very little involvement in legislative efforts regarding police and corrections and so forth. But that would have to be taken care of. And once it's the people to speak up, it's got to be more than a 5-minute news clip, and then it's history. But I have observed it to change over the years. But community policemen, it involves the police and the community, and folks see community policing as a do-gooder type thing. Police work is tough work. It still involves protecting the public. It still involves somebody who breaks crime must go to jail. So that's what the community must understand. And the officers must be involved in the community on a realistic basis. I don't... we've all had this conversation. I believe in incentives to get officers to live in the city and in the parish, because officers, just like everybody else, they want a nice community. They want to go be able to send their kids to certain schools. So it's just not a one-size-fits-all solution. But I think with incentives and upping the standards and the pay would help alleviate that problem.
One of the things that I have said again since the Sterling situation and my response with regard to the need for police reform, and you and I have had this conversation, but I want the podcast audience to have the opportunity to know what we have talked about. I have problems with Baton Rouge police officers who live outside of the parish, some as far away as Mississippi. I have problems with police officers being able to carry Baton Rouge police vehicles back and forth to their residences outside the city. I don't see how you can say that I have a love for a community in which I don't reside. And I recognize that people in the private sector have a right to live wherever they want to live, that we have bedroom communities that exist outside of East Baton Rouge Parish where a large number of people have chosen to live. But I do think that if you are a public servant, which I think police officers are, that it changes the dynamic a little bit. You can't run for office. You can't run for Metro Council or for school board and not live within the district that you're seeking to serve. And in a similar fashion, and I know that it's not exactly apples to apples, but in a similar fashion, I just think that police officers ought to live in the community that they serve.
Well, I don't. I think I'll repeat again. I think officers have a right to live and raise their families, and just like anyone else. We talk about the police department, but DPW, state government. If you get on the interstate at 5 o'clock, those are not all just police officers that exit in Baton Rouge. Those are clerk typists and state workers all going to the surrounding parishes, and so police officers are no different. But I think that the officers should have an intimate relationship with the community they work, particularly where they're assigned to be. You can be involved in the community without residing in the community, and then you follow the money on that. You don't give somebody a pay raise, but you give them a car. And claim that helps with enforcement, and I think you're perfectly right as far as cars going further out to Hammond and places like that. It doesn't reduce crime in Baton Rouge, but I think it's, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the buying all those vehicles and giving every officer a car is a sort of a pay raise type thing. Because if you notice, right in this community, if you see, you might look down the street and see 5 cars at a house. That means that's 5 officers, because each officer has a car. You probably only take 2 to handle the car. Or you constantly see in the city, you see 3 or 4 cars following one another. Because and let's say that, well, that increases response time and things. Now, not if you're spending all your time following one another all over the city. That's me. I might be wrong, and some of them here might get mad at me, but I always had a problem with that. Because I think I don't think it would ever come that you would. I think other cities have tried it. I think it would hamper recruiting, but I think if you have true community policing, where the officers, the detectives, and the research department all are involved in the community, where you meet with the community and decide what the needs is, you interrelate with the other social agencies in the city, and you have enough officers in that community to know that community. And you always hear folks get out the car. Baton Rouge is not like New York, where you walk beats and so forth. You cover a lot of territory. So I think it requires rezoning some of the districts and having officers working in a smaller area, and to really get to know the folk in the community. And then you have to deal with the racial divide. It takes, I suspect some officers, if they're white, they get a culture shock. When you're assigned to, and they grow out of it, they learn to deal with the culture, but just over the time, you cannot police afraid of the folk you decide to protect. Folk may get mad about this. We always talked about procedures. What I suspected before they showed I know Salomon, his father, and mother, nice guy, but he didn't do anything right. He didn't do anything right.
Yes.
And to say that I'm thrown off because I believe that, I've disarmed people. I've fought. I've rolled in the ground with
Yes.
people. You don't have to do that. It's a way to do it, and everybody's differently, but it's a right way and it's a wrong way. In my opinion, it appeared that Lake had the situation under control.
Appeared that way to me also.
So, and officers who get angry or say you're a traitor because you believe. I believe that when I was there. So so
You have been amazingly consistent
Yeah.
over the span. Every time this topic comes up, and by the way, again, for those who don't know, Tommy and I are very good friends, and we spend a lot of time together. We eat lunch together once a week, and we solve all the problems of the world while we're eating lunch. And you have been amazingly consistent in your view with regard to police reform, and that was before the Sterling situation happened, and you've been consistent about it afterward. I didn't want to take up the whole time that we're together just talking about that, but you bring a unique perspective in that you have actually served in the police force. From the Baton Rouge Police Department, you decided that you wanted to become a lawyer, and you went to law school. And you became a lawyer, and you are a practicing attorney here in the city of Baton Rouge. How does your responsibilities, your duties as an attorney affect your responsibilities and duties as a pastor in this community? You're what people commonly label as bivocational. You serve as pastor of Donaldson Chapel Baptist Church, but you're also a practicing attorney. Does one play a role or have an impact in your perspective on the other?
Not at this stage of the game. At 63 years old, you get something that you didn't have 30 or 40 years ago, and that's wisdom. First of all, you're a pastor, but you're a child of God. You're Christ, so your life should reflect Jesus, regardless whatever role you're in. But it becomes a time management issue. The size of my congregation allows me a significant enough time to the practice of law, but it is a challenge, and you're blessed to have help within the congregation. But one of the things, just like we were talking about with police, was just money. I have to pay my bills, so
Right.
I have to. Pastors have to retire.
Yes.
Pastors have children and grandchildren and wives and all of those things. So I did not practice law for 8 or 9 or 10 years, and it was full time. But it reached a stage in my life I had to deal with some other issues, and I said that the Lord blessed me with the law license and a gift. So I'm just blessed that I had something else I can do. But both of them, you deal with people. You deal with people. So it's not the ethical challenge that people would think. Because you have sinners in your practice, you have sinners in the church.
Yes, sir.
And they're very similar.
Yes, sir.
They're very, very similar. And so people say, well, how do you practice criminal defense law and family law? Say sinners in the church, sinners in the community. And lawyers represent people. Lawyers don't commit the crime. I do believe we have a system that needs a lot of reform for our justice system, but it's the best going. So I do believe in the system, and it's just not police work. As a pastor, I've always been active in the community. With housing and education and
Right.
other endeavors. So, and I think more pastors should be involved in the community. For Jesus was involved in the community. So,
I totally agree. Going back to what you were saying about needing to pay your bills, one of the disappointments, I guess, is an appropriate way of putting it, that I have had over the span of years that I have been in the pastorate now, 32 years pastoring black folk, is that by and large, I heard you say earlier that in percentages, Baton Rouge police officers are making about the same now as they were making when you were on the force 40 years ago. Percentage-wise, proportionately, African-American churches are doing about as much in the way of providing full-time care for their pastors now as they were doing 40 years ago. I can't go back 40 years, but I can certainly go back 32 years. And a whole lot about that has not changed. Churches want to put forth the idea that they are full-time churches and have full-time pastors. But when you get down to the X's and O's of what it means to care for a full-time pastor, which includes not just a salary, but health insurance benefits and life insurance benefits and disability benefits and retirement packages and things of that sort. Not to even mention things that others might consider to be luxuries, car allowances and clothing allowances and travel and things. I'm just talking about the nuts and bolts of basic care for a pastor that you are calling to full-time ministry. Very few, less than 10%, perhaps even less than 5% of African American churches in this community actually provide that kind of care. And I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. What are pastors supposed to, those young pastors who are coming out, young men and women who have been called by God and have prepared themselves and trained themselves, gone to seminary, and are ready to devote themselves to a career of service to a congregation, and then they are confronted with the reality that the churches to which they are called are the churches that are considering extending the call to them, while they profess to be full-time churches with full-time compensation, truly are not. What does that say about the state of the church in the year 2018, in your opinion?
Well, you're talking about the African American church in general, and particularly the predominantly African American churches in Baton Rouge.
Yeah,
I think it's economics. I think it's strictly economics. I am blessed to serve as pastor of the church I grew up in.
Right.
So for all practical purposes, I've been there all my life, and you do see the church somewhat differently once you become the pastor, and you're so involved in the lives of the folk. Over time, you learn all their business, and I struggle. In my personal situation, and because of your father, I think they are providing for me as best that they can.
Sure.
And as a whole, the money is just not them. Most of our members are somebody's employee, and we're in a poverty ridden city here in Baton Rouge. Limited opportunities in certain ways. So I think that the status quo will remain for some time. I think young pastors must have a realistic expectation in entering the ministry. And as we often kid about how idealistic we were 20 and 30 years ago, and I think that in some cases we were not the norm. I need to watch how I say this. We we actually wanted to serve. You know, we didn't have. I don't think we ever had any goals about becoming rich.
No.
And so I think you have to have realistic expectations. At the same time, you have to realize how you're going to take care of your family and things. I did not take a vow of poverty.
Right.
So I think realistic expectations, I think it will continue that many of pastors in our community will be bivocational, pastor multiple churches, because I think the economics going to dictate that. And I think one of the things as pastors is that we have to encourage our young people to strive to succeed financially. You know, I think that's where it is. And in traveling, and like you and I, we both had experiences other places and interacted nationally on the denominational level. And it's just not unique to Baton Rouge. It's everywhere.
And that's the point to me that this is not unique to Baton Rouge.
Yes.
This is not unique to Louisiana.
Yeah.
This is across the nation with regard to the African American church, and it crosses denominational lines as well. If people think that this is just a Black Baptist thing, no, it's not. It's a Black Methodist thing. It's a Black Pentecostal thing. There is hardly a denomination that you can call where this dilemma does not exist. And I understand the realities of the economics of it. My concern, and the reason why I'm bringing it up, is because I think that people want to operate from an intentional misunderstanding with regard to the church and the pastor, and the way that the church cares for the pastor and the expectations that the church has of the pastor when they extend a call. There was a period in my ministry when I spent a lot of time looking at calls that were going out to pastors from churches across the country. And almost all of them started with full-time pastor. And yet when you got down to the areas of discussion about compensation, while they said that they were extending a full-time call, it certainly wasn't full-time compensation that they were offering. And so to expect to be able to call someone and demand a certain amount of that person's time, male or female, and demand that this person give this amount of attention to the church, to the neglect of everything else, and not be willing to compensate them appropriately for the demands that you are trying to make on them, there's something about that that's just out of balance. And I wonder what can be done to educate churches, congregations on one end, and educate clergy on the other end as to the realities of this situation.
Well, I think it's a leadership. I think you and I have both benefited from a pastor who did educate his congregation and made some attempt to try to educate others. Pastor Charles T. Smith.
Yes,
I mean, he was very, 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 very passionate about that. Not just the senior pastor, but I owe my ministerial career about his vision of ministerial staff to assist the pastor and the congregation within in the church. I started in Christian education at Donaldson and served in Christian education and administrative capacities here at Shiloh, and it was all because of his vision and many of our brothers and sisters who got our calling under his watch experienced that blessing. But I think it's something else that he often spoke of that would not sound right to folk, but it's the truth. Even though we got too many churches. We cut in the financial pie,
right?
And it's, I don't think it's unique to the African American experience and culture, but I think oppression exasperated the situation. And what do I mean by that? Well, I found it was always there, but when I attended the seminary in Virginia, in reading the writings of Du Bois and, for instance, Carter G. Woodson, it was always that tension, basically where they lambasted the black preacher for leadership. One, that everybody tried to be a preacher,
right?
Because it was the only. At one time in our journey, an African American male, either you were going to be a preacher or a school teacher. That's about all you had,
right?
And so we had a large amount of folk, and I think that pattern still continues to today. When I talked about the expectation, and I think it has been compounded by the myth of the mega church, which is less than 1% of all the churches.
Absolutely.
And folks see pastors buying airplanes and jetting across the country thing. But that is, the average pastor is probably pastoring a 100-member congregation somewhere. And struggling to make a living. So, but I think that, and for so many years, the African American church was the voice of the black community.
Yes.
And that is changing. But financially, until, as a community, African American communities become stronger financially, I don't think the churches will be able to be competitive with the dominant culture churches.
Yeah. I just want people to have a more realistic expectation of what the African American church can offer. And I believe that the African American church can offer a great deal, and it goes beyond dollars and cents. But as I say all the time, if you ain't got no money, you ain't got no ministry, because ministry requires money. And there is a popular myth that has existed for generations within our communities that the African American church has a bottomless pit of financial resources that never run out, and the only thing that keeps us from being able to accomplish major things is that there is greed and there is selfishness that exists within the church, and primarily they focus it on the pastor, and that's what keeps the church from realizing its potential. When a closer examination would reveal, number one, you don't have a bottomless pit of resources. Number two, what African American churches do with the resources that they have at their disposal is nothing short of miraculous. You always want to talk about miracles. Are you ready for a miracle? The miracle is what African American churches are able to accomplish with the meager amount of economic resources that they have at their disposal. And I think that if people had a greater appreciation of what is done with what you have, we all shout when we read about Jesus feeding thousands with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Black Baptist Church has been doing that for generations. We have been providing for people with meager resources for generations, and yet I don't think that the African American church gets enough credit for what they do with the resources that they have at their disposal.
And we have this conversation often, and when I think about Charles Smith, J.R. Williams, H.B. Williams,
H. Freeman,
Chester Forrest.
Yeah.
And I think I just mentioned the other day, they accomplished far more than what we're accomplishing today. Many of them, they had a few school teachers, maybe a professor or two here or there, but they basically had dishwashers, laborers. I was, a few years ago, I was in Savannah, and the first African American Baptist church in Savannah. That was the architect of that church is still standing. The architect was magnificent, but they built that church basically at night and on their own time. They had to go pull rocks out the river, and the women would haul the rocks to the church site. Nobody's going to do any hauling today.
Yeah.
We have become complacent, but we had a common drive to end Jim Crow, to end segregation. Now our focus is more complex in attempting to elevate the folk we pastor, and we do. When you say it's more than resources, I think to this day, most of the leadership and gifts and talent come out of the African American church. It was, where my church, Donaldson Chapel Church, I serve, is in the inner city. And a few years ago, someone asked me, "Well, what do your parents and things think about the public schools in your?" I say, most of my kids in magnet school. So it's I think providing those children and youth and young adults and setting a vision and principle. One of the things I think we do, we help our parents raise their children. Mm-hmm. One of the highest compliments I ever received as a pastor was from a person I grew up. She said, "I want to thank you for helping me raise my son." They kind of, he's an engineer today, you know. Mm-hmm. So those are the types of things that I think the undocumented, and right. It's always been there. It's always been there, you know. So. I think a pastor down the street from me asked me one time, I think I was getting close to 20 years, he said, "What you most bad?" I thought about it. I said, watching those young people grow up, I think that's what I most enjoy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned your seminary training. You are an alum of Virginia Union, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University in Richmond, Virginia. It's also the school where my wife, Reverend Demetria Jones Smith, went. And there seems to be a strong connection between Louisiana, Baton Rouge in particular, and Virginia Union as the place where ministerial training took place. You came out of Virginia Union. William Mabry, who pastors in Monroe area and is from Shiloh Baptist Church, came out of Virginia Union. There are others who have made that crossing. Talk about the Virginia Union experience. I know y'all got a strong union. I hear that quite a lot.
Virginia Union is a predominantly African American seminary on the campus of Virginia Union University, which is HBCU, with a long heritage. This is a small college, and Virginia Union has a reputation, probably in Baptist circles, of being liberal, but it's really not liberal. It's probably moderate in theology, but at the time I was there, and it's probably still the same. It was the heavy focus was on serving the community, preaching, because Virginia Union believed that the path to the minds of the folk we're serving is through preaching. And that you have to preach to their heart and let it grow up to the mind. So it was heavy focus on preaching, but liberation theology was prevalent, but under Dr. Kinney at that time, it was more of a constructive theology, that you were exposed to all the ideas of the great thinkers throughout churches. It was most of the professors pastored the church, but the major, our professors were graduates of Harvard, Pittsburgh, the University of Chicago, places like Princeton and Drew, and so we were exposed to that, and it was the typical HBCU experience compared to what I've learned that other more evangelical seminaries taught, but. So it's a life-changing experience. And many times you don't really benefit from it until years later if you continue to study, because whether it's ministry, whether it's law, whether it's engineering, you never stop studying. So the roots that they plant, the seeds that they plant within you, go a long way. So I was blessed, and it was a son of Shiloh, Reverend Henry Blunt, who passed recently, Reverend Smith, and a good friend from Baton Rouge, D. Mitchell Ford, who encouraged me, and basically Henry Blunt told me I had. Yeah, but it's very similar to the Jaguar family. It's very similar to the Jaguar family. When folks asking me about law school, I say, well, you have 4 good law schools here. But I say, when you mention Southern Law School, I say, you're going to have lifelong friends, across the nation. So,
right.
And I think your wife started the year I left. I think she started right after I did.
Yeah. I know that she loves Virginia Union. Stephen Blunt, who pastors in the Suffolk, Virginia area up there, but has roots here in Baton Rouge. I know a whole lot of Union graduates, and the love that you all express for Union, I must confess, is a little bit different than the feelings that I have when I think about my seminary experience. I appreciate New Orleans, a Southern Baptist school, where I got my seminary training, but appreciation is not the same as devotion and commitment. And I think that in many ways I probably missed out on something because I did not have the Union experience that all the rest of you had.
If you missed out, for instance, my experience at Union was probably not as shocking as some students experience at Union because growing up under Reverend Smith, Reverend Smith was in many ways eclectic theologically,
Yeah.
and a lot of things that were taught at Union did not shock me because Reverend Smith could be very liberal on some things. So especially with his social ethics,
Right.
and he was not he was pretty traditional doctrinally, but for his biblical interpretation, he was an educated man. So
Yeah.
but some students receive a culture shock when they have to deal with other ideas, biblically and theologically. So I didn't. In fact, I was attracted to the depth of the study. So they didn't try to teach you what to think, but how to think. And if you decided to be dogmatic, you had to prove it. And very seldom you could.
Yeah. Well, you just led me into the last thing that I wanted to share with you. You talked about a social ethic that serves as a compass or an anchor for your service, both in ministry and I would presume in law, and as just a Christian citizen of this community. Looking at what's going on in Baton Rouge today, we've only talked about police reform as far as community-wide issues, but there is a strong racial tension that exists within this community, and I don't think that it's simply rooted in race, but it's also rooted in the disparities of economics and the disparities of education that exist, and I think that each one of those bleeds into the other, and whether you're talking about governmental institutions or business institutions or academic institutions, the tension that exists within our community is great. As a Christian, as a person who is interested in social justice issues, what is it that you think is needed in order to bring about some remedy or the beginnings of remedy to the situation as it exists within Baton Rouge?
I think Baton Rouge, we're behind in some areas that maybe some other metropolitan areas they've already experienced. The city limits is close. Within the city is close to predominantly black. We have white flight to surrounding areas. I don't know what I think. As far as the black community concerned, focus on economics, unity, and leadership. Across the spectrum of areas, professional, vocational, church-wise, it's a lack of unity, and we're suffering some leadership problems as compared to yesterday when the church was the focal point. But we had a clear defined agenda: segregation, Jim Crow. But the economic disparity, I think the greatest danger, and I don't think my generation was to deal with it, it's the economic disparity and a generation that recognizes the economic disparity. We're going to have trouble holding on to our young people and those who are here, those who are here realize the disparity. So, and I detect 20 years ago when I knew everything, I had the answers, but now I don't have the answers. But I detect the ill wind, a silent anger, that you take like the issue with the zoo.
Mm-hmm.
People just not buying it,
Right.
they're not buying it.
Right.
You're gonna tell me you're gonna build something, you don't know where you're gonna build it, you don't know how much it's gonna cost,
Right.
but you want me to support it.
Right.
And because I don't support it, I'm anti-progressive.
Right.
You're gonna tear down a library that nobody was going to and build another one right there on top of it.
Yes.
And I'm supposed to understand that.
Right.
But anytime I come up with some progressive idea, it's not time, just because you give statistics and can tell me what happened in Austin or Baltimore or Cincinnati, but some of those folks don't have the issues that we have. Some of those folks, some of them work better.
Right.
I think what's going to happen I think the African American community, we're going to have to harness our political power and join it with economic power.
Mm-hmm.
So but I think my generation on back, I think we were more apt to compromise and work together. I think we still have, but I think there's a growing mass of disinherited, disengaged folk who are not going to be willing to compromise.
I spoke about this last time we did the podcast with Pastor Dale Flowers, and our conversation centered primarily around the school tax, which by the time this podcast is aired or seen, it will be a resolved issue. But we talked about the fact that leadership within our communities is no longer centralized within the church, that there is fracture within the leadership of the African American community, and there are a lot of folk who don't go to church. By and large, statistically speaking, African Americans still go to church more than any other racial group, but that number is changing and the number is shrinking. So one of the things that Pastor Flowers and I talked about is what role does the church play in maintaining cohesiveness and unity as we try to go forward, acknowledging the fact that our role as leader in this effort is not what it once was.
I think the church role is going to be to decide whether we are our brother's keeper and whether we are going to be able to. All of it is not the people's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to be able to work with other people in a team effort? Will Baptists be able to work with your Islamic brother?
Mm-hmm.
Will the so-called heterosexual be able to work with the homosexual?
Mm-hmm.
When you're dealing with a common problem of economics or education, we have to be kind of frank. People don't want to hear a sermon when they talk about building a school. They don't want you don't want to be in the room with me because I have a different faith than you have. So I think that the church is going to have to be more flexible in dealing with with 21st century folk.
Mm-hmm.
Because so sometimes the laity know more than the pulpit.
That's a bold admission to make.
Yeah.
Because while we might say that to ourselves in private conversation, it's seldom heard in public conversation that perhaps the pew has surpassed the pulpit in certain areas.
Yeah, not in in certain areas. Something your daddy used to say: people vote and talk with their feet.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, in closing, I appreciate you taking the time to come and share with us today. As you peer into the near future and perhaps the not so near future, what's your belief about where we're going and how we're going to get there
as a church,
as the church?
I think we're going into. You hear the scholars talk about the emerging church. I think that we're becoming more like Europe, where the church's attendance is not important. I think the church will have to move more toward engagement with the community on a practical basis. That's why I think we're going. I think we're going to have to struggle with issues. Something you said at lunch the other day, that the fundamentalists and the traditionalists change by silence.
Yes.
You and I do marriages, and folks, most of the time, they already living together.
Right.
We just don't say nothing.
That's right.
I think that's where we're growing. A lot of these issues, I think there'll always be a pocket of what we now know as the traditional, but whether we admit it or not, culture greatly impacts the church.
Yes.
And I think we're going to see that impact in the future. Whatever you see in the culture is going to impact the church. I'm not saying it's going to transform the church, but it's going to impact the church.
I tend to agree.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Pastor.
Welcome. You're a great host. You might find I think you found another career here. We got to get you a talk show.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for viewing. Come back and share with us next time for the next Thrive podcast.